All right, welcome to the 513 Zero Product Property walkthrough. We've got two essential questions today. Number one, how can the zero product property help find the x-intercepts? And number two, how can the intercepts help to graph a parabola? All right, let's dive in. All right, to find the x-intercepts from an equation, we need three pieces. I'm going to break it down for you. First, we need to know about the x-intercepts, and I want you to notice something about each of these examples. -1, 0, and 3, 0 are my x-intercepts. -4, 0, 5, 0. And last, -1, 0, and 2, 0. What do they all have in common? Each of these x-intercepts, the x-intercept always takes place when y is 0. So in other words, we know it's an x-intercept. It's going to have the x value, and right here, it's always going to be 0 where the y part would go. All right, so that's the first piece. Let's take a look at the zero product property. And what the zero product property says is that if two quantities multiply to be 0, then either the first quantity is 0 or the second quantity is 0. So in an equation, what this might look like is a times b equals 0. I've got two quantities, two numbers, two values that multiply and give 0. Well, what might that look like? Let's look at a few examples. 1 times 0 is 0. In this case, my b value is 0. Okay? How about 0 times 4? And in this case, my first number, my first quantity is 0. All right? Anytime two numbers multiply to be 0, one of those two numbers is 0, no matter how big or how small. One of the numbers has to be 0. That's what the zero product property says. All right? And if we put these together, along with factoring, I'll show you how we get our x-intercepts. All right, so let's take this equation, right? This function, y equals x squared plus 6x plus 5. Well, we replace the y with 0 because we're finding the x-intercepts, and the x-intercepts always take place when y is 0. Okay, so we plug in 0 for y. All right, how do we get from here to here? Well, this is the process of factoring, right? Taking something, our trinomial, and writing it as the product of the length times the width. All right, well, now that we've got a product, now that we're multiplying, the zero product property applies. Do you see how this connects to this? In this case, this is my A times this is my B. Now, we've been calling it length times width, but A times B, it's still a quantity times a quantity. We have two quantities that multiply to be 0. And so, either the first quantity is 0 or the second quantity is 0. So I set x plus 5 equal to 0. I solve this real simple equation, and I've got x equals -5. And here, x equals -1. So I have two intercepts at -5 and -1. All right. So what that looks like on a graph, my x-intercepts are at -5 and at -1. Okay, now the second part of today's lesson is how do we use those intercepts to help us graph? Well, obviously I can plot those points, but how do I find this point? Now it's given to you here, but I know that this point exists at some x and some y. This is called our vertex, and the vertex has an x-coordinate and a y-coordinate. Well, we did notice that the axis of symmetry passes through the vertex. And where's that axis of symmetry? It's right down the middle. So, x is halfway between the x-intercepts. Well, what does that look like? If I go -5, which is my first x-intercept, and -1, my second x-intercept, and I add them together, and I cut it in half, well, that gives me, let's see, that's -6. -6 divided by 2 is -3. Oh, so this point must be at -3, comma something. Well, how do I find that something? Well, I plug in the x value to find the y value. All right, so here's our original equation, and I'm going to replace x with -3. So x becomes -3, and this x becomes -3, and now we just simplify. All right, -3 squared, 6 times -3 gives me -18, and then I add 5, and all of that works out to be -4. And so I know this value is -4, and voila, I've got my vertex. And if I've got my x-intercepts and I've got my vertex, I know that I'm going to have a nice smooth U-shaped curve that passes through those points. All right, we've answered both our essential questions. Use the x-intercepts to find the vertex, and we find our x-intercepts by using the zero product property and then factoring.